Good evening, fish tankers. Welcome to Drooks on Fish Keeping. This evening you got to excuse my voice. I've had a bad case of a COVID, so it's not 100% yet, but hopefully the microphone will help. I'm going to do a short video about this little plant here, which is of course Anubias. It's a favorite beginner plant because number one, it's virtually indestructible. It's sometimes nicknamed the rubber plant. It's almost as hard to kill as a plastic plant. You don't even need substrate for it. It doesn't need fancy fertilizer. It's got very low light requirements, so it is an easy plant. And how can we grow these plants? Because the one drawback about Anubias is it grows as slow as molasses. I wish I could tell you a fast way to grow Anubias, but I can't. But I do have a few handy tips, 3 of them to be more specific, that I've learned over the years that helps keep these Anubias plants growing slowly as they do, but growing nonetheless, and at least they're not dying. Because they are slow growing, they are of course quite expensive. They're not cheap plants, so you do want them to live. There are many different varieties. You get really big giant ones, you've got small ones like Anubias non petite, you've got Coffeefolia with that nice textured leaves. You also have gold coin Anubias with yellow leaves. There's even one with a white leaf that's now come out. But more or less they all require the same care. It's a tough little plant, so if you're ready for free tips to keep your Anubias growing in your aquarium, stay tuned. Now the first tip for growing Anubias, it is of course an epiphyte, which means that you must never plant it in the sand or in the gravel, because as you can see, there's roots underneath, and there, if I go closer, you'll see the roots there. They're stuck in the sand, and above it, that little stem that grows horizontally, that's a rhizome, and the leaves come out of it. If you absolutely have to attach it to your substrate, you can take the roots, as you see there of that little plant, you can stick the roots in the sand or in the gravel, or whatever substrate you have. You can stick the roots in there, but the rhizome, that little horizontal stem, must at all times be above the substrate. If you stick that in the substrate, it will rot and die. So you've got to attach your Anubias. If you want to have it on the substrate, you can do it this way by just sticking the roots there. But I don't do it. I just did this for demonstration purposes. I do find that my bottom dwellers, my bristlenose plecos, my clownfish, they simply dislodge it and it ends up floating. And Anubias is so tough it will survive floating, but then the leaves call in all kinds of weird ways. You don't want it floating, you want to attach it somewhere. So how do you attach it? Now, how does one attach Anubias? You can attach it to driftwood or spiderwood, and there are several different ways. You can use aquascaping line. It's a sort of a line that you just wind around the rhizome, and the line sort of sticks, and it works like that. You can also go to a bait shop. It's a lot less expensive. You can use that thread that I use to put the bait on fishing hooks. That can also work. I have in the past even tied some epiphytes, Anubias and Java fin to driftwood using just plain old fishing line, although that's difficult to work with. Getting it tied down seems to be quite a thing. Then the popular way to do it is simply to use a bit of super glue. Now here you can see you don't want too much super glue. I've already gone too far with it, it seems. So just for demonstration purposes, I like having tiny little pieces of driftwood, and then you can just move it around in the aquarium. So I'm just going to put a small bead of super glue there. And then I'm just going to press it in there, and there it sits. Don't overdo it, and put the super glue on whatever you're attaching the Anubias to. Put it on the wood or on the rock, and just a little drop, and then you stick the rhizome onto that super glue, and there you go. You must not use too much. otherwise it will crystallize around the rhizome and the rhizome will rot. That's one way, and my favorite way of doing it is simply to get a piece of wood. Spider wood is great for that because it's got all sorts of crevices, and just wedge the Anubias into that crevice. You can see here what I did. I just pushed the Anubias, the rhizome, into that crevice in this little piece of driftwood, and there you are. No super glue, no line needed, you just wedge it. You can also, even with these little roots of a spider wood that goes around and around, you can just sometimes even just fit the Anubias underneath that spider wood where it's between the leaves and the rhizome. You know, it's just wedged underneath it. So that's my favorite way of attaching Anubias. I don't actually like the super glue and the thread. I simply, whenever I go to an aquarium shop, I collect little pieces of driftwood that's got crevices in it, and I just wedge it. You can wedge it between rocks. That's the easiest way. Simply wedge it somewhere. But if not, you can always use the various types of line and the super glue. Just careful with the super glue, not too much. So there you go. There are a couple of ways that you can attach the Anubias. Okay, so now after we have attached the Anubias, here you see it's sitting there wedged on the bottom of the driftwood. What about the water quality to give the Anubias optimal growth rate? Now, this is not what I've researched, it's just what I've found. In the past, when my tanks weren't these dirted tanks, this particular one is not, but it's got the same water parameters. I've got soft acidic water coming out of my tap. So 6.5 coming out of a tap. It's got almost no KH or GH, and it easily drops down to under the 6, in the high 5 sometimes. And I found the Anubias sort of just stayed the same. For every little leaf that formed, there would be a leaf yellowing and dying. It just sort of survived. But recently, after I've got the soil mixture in some of the tanks, this particular puffer tank has got a little bit of minerals in it. I use some alkaline buffer by Seachem, but my other tanks have got soil layer in that's got some bone meal, and my tanks these days have got a pH of around 7.5, 7.2, slightly alkaline. It's got a general hardness of 10, and it's got some KH. It's got a carbonate hardness of 6. So there's a little bit of minerals in my aquarium water now, and that has definitely helped with the Anubias. So that is the number 2 tip. The Anubias need a bit of minerals in the water, so make sure that you've got about 6 degrees of carbonate hardness, a hardness of around somewhere between 8 and 10. I just need a little bit of minerals in the water, so you can always just put in a little bit of crushed coral if your water is very soft, and the Anubias will thank you for it. So I find they do like a little bit of hardness in the water. Okay guys, the other thing about the Anubias plant, the number 2 thing, is once we have attached it to a rock, to some driftwood or spiderwood, where do we place the Anubias? That is an important thing. Now there we see some small Anubias plants attached to the spiderwood, and this has been going for a long time. You can see it's growing some new leaves there, and then the one to the left and then the one to the right. You'll see there is a little bit of green spot algae there. And then as I look to this big Anubias plant here on the spiderwood in my 29-gallon aquarium, you can see there's a nice new leaf coming out there. And it's doing reasonably okay. But it has got quite a bit of green spot algae on the leaves, but not enough to choke the leaves, anything like that. We've got the nereid snails that keep that green spot algae under control, and that helps a little bit. But if we see where both these Anubias plants are placed, they are quite directly under the aquarium lights. So it's quite directly under the lights. And that is something that is a bit difficult to avoid, because we're not having Anubias as the only plant in here. But that's what you see what happens when they are sort of directly under the lights. They grow well, they make new little leaves, but you do always have that battle of, I find, mostly green spot algae, but other algae as well, because as we know, it is a very slow growing plant. Which brings us to what we have over here. Now there you can see there's a nice big Anubias plant there on the spiderwood. It's just been wedged there among the roots and everything that these spiderwood balls have. You can see there's very little algae, and even there we've got those Colombian tetras in the way, but you can see there's a very nice little new leaf developing. There's good leaf growth, minimum amount of algae going on. And if I go here to the other side of the same aquarium, we can see the same thing happening here. Quite a nice bunch of leaves going out here. If I go around, there's the Otto in front of us. So I have to try and focus here through the, what is that, the Cryptocorini in front of me. But you can see, if we get that angle, there's a lot of new leaf growth, and the growth is very clean. So this is by far where I get my best Anubias growth, is in the big tank downstairs. And what's different about where we place our Anubias, it's not under the direct light, it's got a lot less light. So that's my third piece of advice. Place the Anubias in a shady spot. You can see it's sort of underneath the spiderwood. There's some other leaves above it, not in the dark. The rhizome still needs to get a bit of light. The rhizome mustn't be in the dark when it turns to mush and it starts dying. But put it sort of close to an overhang where it just gets enough light, but not in the direct light. We can see here as well. There you can see the Vallisneria that grows like a house on fire, grows all over the surface. It creates some shade, but the light still shines through. So it's not in so much direct light. It's still quite a bit of light, but it's got slightly less light. It's in the more shady area. So if you do place those Anubias plants, make sure that you place them in a more shady area. I just find that there's less algae trouble on the leaves then, and they do pop those new leaves every now and then, and over time it becomes quite a sizable plant. You can see there how far it goes down. Well, that's it guys from me. Those are my 3 tips of growing Anubias. It's going to still grow slowly, but that way it is at least growing, and eventually you have a substantial plant, and they'll just go on and on for years, providing shelter to the fish, and they also look very nice. If you found these 3 tips useful, please hit that thumbs up button. That'll help with the YouTube algorithm. I'll greatly appreciate it. And please, if you like the channel, consider hitting that subscribe button. I will greatly appreciate that as well. And until we see each other again, keep taking good care of those domestic denizens of the deep.